Hey guys, so my last lesson was on the parts of the nervous system, and today's lesson is going to be the parts of a neuron and a reflex arc, okay? So I'm just going to flip my new technology this way because I'm going to show you, okay, parts of a neuron and what a reflex arc is, okay? So we're going to start, and I'm going to start by showing you the diagram that I did last class or last lesson, where I drew a brain. Okay, so imagine this is like the base of your brain, and this is your spinal cord. Okay, so here's your brain, and here's your spinal cord. So brain, spinal cord. Okay, because what I'm going to do with you guys is we're going to look at the parts of a neuron together, and we're going to talk about a reflex arc. Okay, so in my last lesson, I told you that we have what are called sensory receptors that are part of a neuron called the sensory neuron, and I'm going to draw that sensory neuron a little bit bigger. So here is the sensory neuron, and the sensory neuron kind of looks like this, okay? And you got to know the parts. So you already know, like, this is the receptor, and the receptor detects stimulus, and the stimulus could be like a pin or heat, right? And this receptor, right, will send that signal of that stimulus. So like, let's say this was a baroreceptor, which detects pressure, that signal will be sent from the receptor, and it will go down this structure here called a dendrite. Now, this is called a dendrite, and the definition of a dendrite, it always leads towards the cell body. Okay, now this part is called the cell body, and that's because this part has a nucleus inside of it. And so remember that this is like a cell, like when you talked about the cells in Science 10, that cell had a nucleus and it had cytoplasm. Well, so does this cell. I mean, inside here is cytoplasm, except this cell looks funny, right? There's cytoplasm in here too. It's like a long, funny-looking cell with arms on either end of it, but it's still a single cell, right? And this single cell is called a sensory neuron, right? So this single cell that I drew here is the sensory neuron, and sensory neurons detect sensation, and they belong to the somatic division of our nervous system, which we talked about last lesson. Okay, so this is the dendrite, and then this here is called the axon. And the axon always leads away away from, cell body. That's what the axon does. Now, this part at the end right here that I drew, that's called the axon terminal. Okay, so we've reached the terminal or the end of the axon. Like terminal means the end. And at the end are these, like, they're called synaptic knobs or sometimes synaptic bulbs. And they're found at the end of the neuron. So you can see this is a real specialized neuron, right? It looks kind of different than the other kinds of cells that you have learned, but these are the basic parts of a neuron. This sensory neuron, right, is attached to another neuron that we learned last time, and we're going to draw it. And this neuron that I'm drawing right here, because it's located, the entire neuron is located inside the spinal cord. It's the interneuron, right, which we learned about in the last lesson. And so this interneuron is made up of the exact same parts as the sensory neuron, okay? So this here with the nucleus inside of it is called the cell body, okay? So if that's the cell body, then what's the name of this structure that's leading to the cell body? Okay, that must be the dendrite, okay? These dendrites lead to the cell body, and that just means that this part over here, which is leading away from the cell body, is called the axon. okay? And that this part at the end is called the axon terminal. Okay, so remember, like when we're dealing with a nerve impulse, okay, when we're dealing with the nerve impulse, we're dealing with the impulse traveling in one direction. So the impulse is traveling here, and then the impulse travels here. And when the impulse is traveling, right, it's going from the dendrite to the cell body, from the cell body to the axon terminal. Same thing here, from the dendrite to the cell body, from the cell body down the axon to the axon terminal, which is at the end here. That's the axon terminal, okay? And again, there's like these synaptic knobs at the end of the axon terminal, which we're going to talk about them later and why they're important. Okay, now this neuron that's called the interneuron is actually connected to the next neuron, and the next neuron is called the motor neuron. So here is the motor neuron. Right here is the motor neuron, okay? And so the motor neuron has these structures, right? Same sort of thing, right? And then they have these long axons here, and these, right, and with these structures right here like that, okay? So again, when you guys like name these parts, right, well, what are these like hair-like structures coming out of that called? Well, this part in the middle is the cell body because it contains the nucleus, and this part over here is called the dendrite. Okay, so the dendrite, right, leads towards the cell body. And that means that this long structure, which is leading away from the cell body, is called the axon, right? And this part here is called the axon terminal. And the axon terminal has these bulbs on it called synaptic bulbs or knobs. Same thing, okay? So there you have, this is the motor neuron, okay? And so the motor neuron and the sensory neuron, again, are part of the somatic system of your peripheral nervous system, right? And we talked about the autonomic nerves last time and how they're responsible for the stress and the rest and digest. And we're going to talk about those later on. So what we just did here was we just defined all the parts and named all the parts of a neuron and of the sensory, inter, and motor neuron. Now there is another structure that you have to know that is found in these neurons. So you have this structure that actually surrounds, and I'm drawing it a different color because it's actually a different kind of cell that makes up this called myelin. Okay, this is the myelin sheath. And you find this myelin on the motor neuron and the sensory, and you can see it's surrounding the axon and part of the dendrite of the sensory neuron. So this is myelin. Okay, notice that I'm not drawing any myelin in the interneuron because interneurons can be non-myelinated and they can be myelinated. It can be both myelinated or non-myelinated, okay? So we're going to show you, when you have this myelin that surrounds the axon, this actually helps speed up the nerve impulse, okay? That's the function. It does that by preventing, right, charged ions, right, from getting through. And this might not make any sense right now, but we're going to discuss why it's like really important to prevent charged ions from going through in terms of speeding up the impulse, right? So if you have myelin, you're going to get increased speed of neural transmission, right? If you're non-myelinated, that just means you have decreased speed of neural transmission, okay? And myelinated, anything that's myelinated is called like white matter because myelin looks white, it's fatty. And because it's fatty, that's what the fat is actually what's preventing the charged ions from getting through. And non-myelinated neurons are called gray matter because they don't have the fatty myelin that surrounds them. And so that's the difference between white matter and gray matter. You can see this sensory neuron that I drew here has also myelin on it. So that just means that the sensory and the motor, they're going to have an increased speed of neural transmission, whereas the interneuron, because it doesn't have myelin, it's not going to be as fast, okay? And then there's gaps between, okay? So you see these gaps between the myelin, those are called nodes of Ranvier, and we're going to talk about that in the next lesson. Okay, that becomes important, node of Ranvier. Okay, so here you have it. Here are the parts of the neuron, right? Now, the myelin that I just drew in green is actually the myelin is made up of what we call a Schwann cell. So you have the neuron, which I drew, right? Like, so I can draw the neuron. So you have that like weird looking neuron, but then you have like the myelin that surrounds it. And I draw it in a different color because it's actually a different type of cell, right? It's not actually a part of the neuron. It's a cell that supports the neuron. So the Schwann cell is supportive cell, right? That surrounds the neuron. Okay. And it makes up the myelin. So like imagine like, okay, so imagine like here's your axon right here. So here's your axon, right? And the axon, right, is surrounded, like imagine this is like a Schwann cell. So here's the Schwann cell. And the Schwann cell actually is like, imagine the axon being like the toilet paper roll. And the Schwann cell is the actual paper, right? And imagine like the paper surrounding the toilet cardboard part inside. Well, this is the Schwann cell. So the Schwann cell is the paper that wraps itself around the cardboard, circular structure inside the toilet paper. And the Schwann cell, right, these layers of Schwann cell actually make up the myelin, okay? And the last layer of the myelin, right, is the nucleated layer. So that you can see this is the last layer of the myelin that I'm just drawing in right here, and I colored it in. The last layer of the myelin is called the neural lemma, and that neural lemma actually regenerates damaged axons. Okay, so you can see like, because the sensory neuron has myelin and because the motor neuron has myelin, this myelin, right, the last layer of that myelin, that Schwann cell that makes up that myelin, right, has that neural lemma that allows these peripheral nerves to regenerate. But this interneuron doesn't have that myelin, so it doesn't have the ability to regenerate. In fact, none of the interneurons in the brain or the spinal cord have any ability to regenerate. So like if you damage that, the damage becomes permanent. There are some brain cells that are myelinated, like you do have some brain cells that are myelinated, but there's actually no neural lemma on the myelinated brain cells. And even in the spinal cord, there's some myelinated neurons in the spinal cord, but again, there's no neural lemma in them. So like it's permanent damage. If these are like, if you like break your spinal cord, right? Let's say you break it right here. Well, there can be no signal sent to your brain, right? And so the damage is permanent. And this is how people become paralyzed and they can't feel their arms or their legs or anything like that. Because imagine like if this impulse is in your arm, imagine this is like a funny looking arm and you break it right here. Well, guess what? Your sensory neurons cannot send the signal to your brain, right? You can't move your limbs because the motor neuron's been cut from here, right? So you can't sense anything, you can't move anything. And so that's why these kinds of breaks are really, really like traumatic and you lose function, okay? So there you have that. Now, when I talk about a reflex arc, I just did it on the other end. A reflex arc involves a receptor that goes to a sensory neuron, that goes to a motor neuron. Sorry, I forgot. That goes to an interneuron, that goes to a motor neuron, and then goes to a effector. Now, the effector is like a muscle. So if you look at the diagram here, it's exactly what I just drew. The receptor, sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron, to a muscle at the end. The only reason why we call it a reflex arc is because it's involuntary. It's like when you touch a hot stove, right? If it's extremely hot, you withdraw your hand automatically to prevent further harm. It's not like you touch a really hot stove and you keep your finger on it and you watch your flesh burn away, right? Your body has this instinctive reflex to move your finger, and that's because the receptor, right, activates the sensory, and the interneuron that is being activated is actually only in your spinal cord. So there is no brain input in a reflex arc. So there's no brain input. It just goes through the spinal cord only, and that's why it is so fast, right? Because there is no brain input. Your brain inputs after, like, ouch, my finger hurts, let me get a Band-Aid, like after you process that you touched a stove, then you start going into action. That's your brain. But the actual movement of your hand, which is like a millisecond, is the reflex arc, right? And so it involves all the neurons I just showed you, the receptor, sensory, intermotor, and neuron to the effector, except you are going through the spinal cord, which is why it's so fast. Notice that because you're using sensory and motor, that these two are part of your somatic nervous system. And remember I said sometimes your somatic nervous system is involuntary. It is involuntary when you have your reflex arc, because that's what is involuntary, is the reflex arc, which goes through your spinal cord, right? It can also be voluntary, like I mentioned before, like if somebody sticks you with a pen, but they're like, don't move, and then you try really hard not to move because you can actually force yourself not to move because that's voluntary, but that still involves sensory and motor. Right? If somebody sticks a pin in you, you're still activating your sensory neurons, but you're like willing your motor neurons not to move your muscle, even though it hurts, right? But the reflex arc is involuntary, but it still involves the sensory and motor neuron, right? So that's part of your somatic nervous system, right? So that's just the reflex arc. Receptor, sensory, motor neuron, effector, muscle, right? So receptor, sensory, right? Interneuron, motor neuron. That's the pathway of the reflex arc, right? Effector, which is just the muscle that moves. That's what an effector does, okay? And so this part would be your spinal cord, and you can see that there's no brain input. It just is here, right? And then here, and then afterwards, you will have other interneurons involved that will send a message to your brain to like deal with whatever injury that's been caused. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Another reflex is like in your knee, where you tap your knee and your knee just jerks involuntarily without you even having to, like, there's no conscious control, right? So if you're paralyzed, that wouldn't work, right? Okay, anyways, so